All right, I'm Reed Federer,
I'm Ryan King.
and we're here discussing our articles we chose for the Pursue Your Interest project.
So my paper was like the context of it was during COVID, and it was some researchers were trying to find at least some trends to where the disease like affected people the hardest, and then I guess they after a little bit of time they went into some more data and they found that the air pollution in these areas that were more industrial were getting people with more ICU cases and people who stayed a lot longer. So that led to the paper that's titled "The Severe Air Pollution Linked to High Mortality in COVID-19 Patients: The Double Hit Hypothesis." And this was conducted by researchers at the San Raffaele Science Institute in Italy by the head researcher Antonio Frontera. And their main hypothesis was that there's a correlation between particle matter that's 2.5 micrometers or picometers in size and NO2 in nitrogen like in the air, and that would link to higher effects of COVID on these hospitals and of these patients. And so their main methodology to try to test this was they just looked at population data of that was just provided through the public information through the Italian Civil Protection Agency, and then they just conducted a graph trying to kind of correlate it through both the quantitative means and then also through just their research based on the science more of how particle matter and how that can affect your lungs. So I have my visual this is the graph that they made. It on the x-axis it's the number of emissions per cumulative days, and on the y-axis it's the ambient picomatter or particle matter in 2.5 picometers and of the concentration, and it found a direct link between the two. And this kind of gets at their conclusion, which is like that there's a link between the COVID effective or how it hits people and the air pollution. And this kind of the double hit hypothesis that they're kind of getting at is that the particle matter kind of scars your lungs and weakens it, and with the COVID then it hits you even harder. So that's why these patients were in the hospital for much longer. And some of the inferences that they made were they were kind of getting at the correlation between the two different particles and kind of trying to find that the interrelationships as like between the people and the factories really is pretty significant, and that the correlation due to their system thinking kind of led them to this argument.
Yeah, so one question I have for you is, well, the study you were looking at measured in state variables, and do you think looking at the rate variables of those harmful particles during COVID, maybe they dropped due to less production in factories and that sort of thing? Do you think looking at the rate variables would maybe show different or similar results?
Yeah, I do believe so. I think they were pretty pressed for time in this one, and obviously COVID made a lot of these scientists just had to try to find some reasoning for why certain areas were hit harder. But I think tracking this over time with rate variables, whether that be comparing it from then to now or each year, or even day by day, as like what you said, during COVID there might not have been as much production. I feel like that could have been interesting and maybe solidified more findings as to not just finding a specific moment in the past and then kind of basing that off their study. But I think it was pretty clear. I mean, the data was somewhat over time, but I do think that would have been interesting.
Mm-hmm. All right, so for my article that I looked at, it was titled "The Maternal Effects Better Predict Walleye Recruitment in Escanaba Lake, Wisconsin." This was done from 1957 to 2015, and there were multiple authors on this, conducted through mainly the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and it was funded by the Wisconsin DNR. And just for some brief background on this article, it took place in northern Wisconsin on a lake called Escanaba Lake, where researchers looked into how various factors affected walleye survival rates and hatching rates, and how different factors among the walleye population itself may have affected the survival of young fish. So this article tested 3 hypotheses. The first one was looking at the variables among female spawning walleye, which may explain the change in recruitment. And recruitment is the survival of the fish from egg until a certain adult size. So just making sure they have a decent life cycle and seeing if that change in recruitment is more than the abundance of all adults. And the second hypothesis was the survival rates of fish in relation to the size of the female fish which were laying the eggs. And the third hypothesis was looking at how recreational fishing may affect the spawning potential of fish. So the walleye population dynamics were looked at from 1957 until 2015, every single year, from looking at egg to the adult sized fish. And there was certain years where a size limit was put into place on the walleye. So they studied how having a different size limit on these fish may have affected the survival rates. The size of the spawning females were looked at, and then the amount of newly hatched walleye or amount of eggs that were laid. So the independent variables that were observed, which had from greatest to least effect on the recruitment rates. So greatest effect was the annual egg production. The second most was the abundance of the spawning females. And then the third most was the total amount of adult fish, male or female. So other findings were that the survival of juvenile fish increased when the percent of spawning females was highest among the larger fish. So if larger fish were spawning, there was a greater chance of survival. And there were multiple graphs made among each of the variables I discussed that they looked at, which affected it, these recruitment rates. And so here on the x-axis, there's the total egg production that they recorded, and then on the y-axis was the recruitment abundance, so how many fish were able to survive to become an adult size. And among the 3 graphs, this one had the highest correlation. It was the strongest in showing that this is the variable which is most important to the survival of these fish. So then a couple conclusions from this from the research done was that the results are very in line with the hypothesis, which was predicted that bigger fish spawning would be beneficial to survival. More fish laying eggs, or more eggs being laid, I suppose, is beneficial. And then having more restrictions on which fish you can keep is beneficial to the survival as well.
Yeah, so how does the complexity of the system of both the lake and the many factors that come into it, and then the fish, like the birthing of the fish, how does that kind of like affect the methodology that these researchers like had to play into?
So these researchers they simplified it so it was all numerical data, number of eggs or number of fish that survived. And so year by year, no matter the circumstances, they were able to look at proportions the same. The bigger fish spawning always came out to be a higher survival rate for the eggs. And so it didn't matter, say a year there's extreme weather, like a big freeze on the lake, and affects the fish, maybe kills a lot of them, or the plants themselves too, their cover. It didn't matter so much those specific years they were able to look at.